I'm ahead of the curve, and in this book review, I will be discussing David Bentley Hart's The Doors of the Sea, first published in 2005. As news reports of the horrific December 2004 tsunami in Asia reached the rest of the world, commentators were quick to seize upon the disaster as proof of either God's power or God's non-existence, asking over and over, how could a God and loving God, if such exists, allow such suffering? In The Doors of the Sea by David Bentley Hart speaks at once to those skeptical of Christian faith and to those who use their Christian faith to rationalize senseless human suffering. He calls both to recognize in the worst catastrophes not the providential will of God, but rather the ongoing struggle between the rebellious powers that enslave the world and the God who loves it wholly. So basically, this book is not an apologetics piece as such. It is two essays, fairly long essays, let's say, and it's put into this small, very compact book. And it is, as you have heard, trying to answer the question of where was God in the tsunami. So the first essay in this book is Universal Harmony, and this is when David Bentley Hart responds to critics of the event and people, atheists, using the event to disprove or refute, debunk, try and mutilate the Christian faith in some sense. So yeah, it's kind of, the first essay is a kind of response to the responses, if you get what I mean. And the Divine Victory essay is much more of a philosophical, biblical, theodicy sort of analysis of suffering, the problem of evil. So in response to these criticisms of the tsunami, saying that God could not be good because he creates such suffering, David Bentley Hart believes that the event is reconcilable because we can't possibly begin to understand the grander universal scheme that God has upon his creation, or so he believes. At some level, it is even tempting to think that since strict materialism is among the most incoherent of superstitions, one that has never really asked the question of the being of things in any depth or with any persistence, or one that has at best attempted to conjure that question away as a fallacy of grammar, it is incapable of imagining any conception of God more sophisticated than its own. The materialist encounters an instance of unjust suffering and, by a sort of magical thinking, concludes from the absence of any immediately visible moral order that there must be nothing transcendent of material causality. In much the same way that certain of our more remote primitive ancestors might have seen a flash of lightning in the sky and concluded that God must have flung it from on high. In neither case does the conclusion follow from the evidence, though in the latter case the reasoning is somewhat more rigorous, and in neither case is the God at issue more than an effective myth. So what David Bentley Hart is saying here is effectively that the idea of God that these atheists have when they criticize God and when they discuss theodicy in response to the tsunami in 2004, the conception that they have of God is not the same as that which the Christian God is supposed to be, following the scripture as far as David Bentley Hart is concerned. So effectively, David Bentley Hart is saying that these atheists are strawmanning because they are attacking a God that they do not actually understand in comparison to what Christianity describes that God as. So yeah, apparently the atheists are strawmanning and they don't understand what God is. I'm very dubious of this concept that we should bow down and surrender to this concept that we are below God and that we can't possibly begin to understand him, because it's an argument that points both ways. Because if we can't understand God as an atheist, even if we have read some scriptures, let's say, who's to say that Christians understand God? Christopher Hitchens said a small sentence, which is, how do you claim to even know God's motives, what he wants? And then the Christian could say, well, we read the Bible and we interpret the Bible. But then obviously the response to that is, well, clearly different denominations have different interpretations. So there's an issue here, right? And it isn't as cut and dry as I think Christians kind of make it, because it's like, yeah, well, my interpretation is true. It's like, well, is it though? Because there are many, many different denominations of the Christian faith, let alone loads of different monotheisms, Islam, Judaism, etc. So I think that it isn't that easy to shrug off, right? Because, look, I get that there is a philosophical concept behind mere humans not being able to understand a literally immaterial superior deity, right? And I get that. But as I said, it goes both ways. Who's to say that any of us can understand, from a scripture that's made by humans as well? I mean, apparently it's divinely inspired, but who are we even to know that? Because by definition, what can we know? The epistemology is very, there's a lot of contention there, because the very claim that the Christian or even indeed the religious individual could put forward, I could put forward to them back. And this isn't to say as well that atheists don't commonly strawman theists. Of course they do. I mean, of course. In the same sense that Christians might mischaracterize atheists as fully fledged nihilists, or like Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. It's like clearly not. So on some level, and this is the thing I find with David Bentley Hart, like on some level I agree with him, but then he just goes that extra step further, and I just can't get on board with that. I feel like one of the things that Christians and believers in general cannot be acquitted of, quite frankly, it is wishful thinking. It is this sort of imagination, this leap that they take. It's this Kierkegaardian leap, right? And as I appreciate the logic behind that, and I see where he's coming from, Kierkegaard himself said it's still a leap. He even admitted that it is a intellectual surrender in some sense. That doesn't sit well with me, because we all have to make these surrenders throughout our lives, but it's one based off of reason, not just blind faith. When I cross the road, I don't cross the road without looking. I actually look and I gather the visual evidence that there probably isn't a car, right? And so, a lot of Christians like to say, oh, well, it's the same thing because we take leaps of faith every single day. It's like, well, we don't though, do we? Because we look when we cross the road. We do all those sorts of things. And obviously the contrary could be put, well, if you read the scriptures and you understand God, and if you understand the arguments, then they all form a cumulative case, like William Lane Craig would say. And I respect that, but at the same time, I'm not convinced at the same time that the pieces of evidence that make that cumulative case stand together, let alone alone. So you have to be very careful with how these arguments are formed, because they can be quite misleading. I wish to also grant David Bentley Hart this point as well. I don't think that you can necessarily refute God's existence by suffering alone. And I agree with him that that is a bad approach to take as a disbeliever, or as anyone who's opposing an argument, to say that, oh, well, because there's suffering, God does not exist. I mean, that doesn't follow, philosophically speaking. The only thing that it does achieve, however, is to undermine the promises by God, or by the scriptures that have followed him. So, and again, this is kind of like David Bentley Hart taking liberties again, because I think he would know that, but he doesn't make it obvious that he knows that, because he's trying to say that it's done and dusted, but really it's just a semantic misdemeanor, isn't it? It's kind of like taking advantage of that poor argument and assuming that that's all there is to it. It's like, well, not necessarily. Yes, sure, it doesn't refute God, but it definitely undermines God. I mean, that's for sure. The problem of suffering definitely undermines God. Not the existence necessarily, although it can. It undermines the tenets of which God is defined by in monotheism in general. Further into the book, and this is on the divine victory section, because the first section, I must admit, was not as interesting. It had some good responses by David Bentley Hart, but I feel like the second half of the book is where it really, really picks up. And that's, as I said before, that's where the more philosophical aspects of it shine through. And also, David Bentley Hart goes on to talk about Dostoevsky and Ivan's character in The Brothers Karamazov. And I want to read out a relatively short passage on theodicy, on the morality of suffering. Here we go. As soon as one sheds the burden of the desire for total explanation, as soon as one has come to see the history of suffering as a contingency and an absurdity, in which grace is ever at work, but upon which it does not depend, and has come also to see the promised end of all things not as a dialectical residue of a great cosmic and moral process, but something far more glorious than the pitiable resources of fallen time could ever yield, one is confronted with only this bare choice. Either one embraces the mystery of created freedom and accepts that the union of free spiritual creatures with the God of love is a thing so wonderful that the power of creation to enslave itself to death must be permitted by God, or one judges that even one such rational freedom is worth the risk of a cosmic fall and the terrible injustice of the consequences that follow from it. But then, since there can be no context in which such a judgment can be meaningfully made, no perspective from which a finite Eleusinian mind can weigh its logical glory in balance against earthly suffering, the rejection of God on these grounds cannot really be a rational decision, but only a moral pathos. Okay, so that was maybe a fairly complex series of words. As I was reading it, I was just like, yeah, this is a pretty complex passage here. So let me try and break it down. So again, David Bentley Hart is pressing on this concept that we don't need to have the full explanation in order to believe that moral suffering is justified in some sense. And look, whilst I see, again, the philosophical reasons for that, sure, okay, look, we have to be ignorant in some sense because we are ignorant creatures. Even if we try and help it, we will still be in some sense ignorant anyway. To reject God because of the suffering that exists, that is not a rational argument, he says. It is instead a moral pathos. And what he means by that is we are judging the morality of God and comparing it to our own standards of good and evil from our, as he says there, very simplistic, animalistic mind. And so, again, with David Bentley Hart, I agree that that's valid, but I don't think that excuses to just put our hands up and not necessarily question the depraved sort of things that God permits. Why not just make it clearer that there is actually a reason, or not a reason, but actually a permissible reason why these things are happening? What utility does a child who's born until they're 5, they have cancer of the throat, for example? I mean, what utility does that have? You know, and you could say, well, not only is that unknowable, yeah, sure, but also that it serves some greater purpose because maybe down the line there was something that would happen that would change the face of history in some profound way. Look, I appreciate that as a concept, but it is just a concept, and it's a very imaginative one at that. Too imaginative for me, I believe, because it does take imaginative liberties. We don't know. And what David Bentley Hart and other Christians have to do, let alone any monotheist, is have to put forward this theoretical, basically baseless assumption that it is all for the greater good. I mean, there's no evidence to say that. There's no even reason to say that. I would maybe even be so bold to submit. There is no solid reasoning behind why that should just be ultimately accepted. Yeah, philosophically, we don't know everything, therefore we could just surrender to God's will and we'll just take whatever he has to give us. And not only is that very subservient and servile, etc., etc., it's also just a surrender of the intellect in some sense. And it's just, again, very, very unsatisfying. Philosophically sound, but not necessarily valid. David Bentley Hart goes on to say, further on from this rough concept, that God is not good or evil necessarily, but free, because he is beyond good and evil. I'm just thinking of Nietzsche now, which probably will serve me some intellectual rigor, I guess, in this video. So it's a healthy free association. But David Bentley Hart says, to be capable of evil, to be able to do evil, or to be affected by an encounter with it, would in fact be an incapacity in God, and to require evil to bring about his good ends would make him less than the God he is. The object of God's will is his own infinite goodness, and it is an object perfectly realized, and so he is free. So according to David Bentley Hart, God is free because he cannot contradict his own nature. Therefore, God cannot take the criticism of being bad, morally bad, because by definition he is good. Now, the biggest issue with this, and it is a liberty by David Bentley Hart, because he's assuming that we believe that God is good, and not only is he good, but he's assuming that we also believe in God, which this is the problem with the presuppositional argument. It is just breaking the circular argument fallacy. It assumes that God is good to try and debunk the argument that he isn't. It's such a major error by David Bentley Hart. Very disappointing. The following passage is David Bentley Hart backing up this previous concept that we must surrender to the will of God and his predestination, or his foreknowledge of reality as a whole, of events such as the tsunami from occurring. He's defending God in this regard. There are those for whom saying this leaves behind an intolerable reminder, a kind of irrational surd. For them, unless one believes that every event has a substantial and organic place in the plot of universal history and a specific function in the final synthesis of history at the end of time, then somehow the logical coherence of the universe begins to disintegrate, and God's final resolution of the story of the world is little more than a vulgar deus ex machina. But of course, nothing is lost. The coherence of the universe is preserved by God, acting to save what he has made, what is real, what has substance, not by providing a divine rationale for every dimension of every event in which his creatures are involved, no matter how much those events might reflect that ultimate privation, evil. There is, of course, some comfort to be derived from the thought that everything that occurs at the level of secondary causality in nature or history is governed not only by a transcendent providence, but by a universal teleology that makes every instance of pain and loss an indispensable moment in a grand scheme whose ultimate synthesis will justify all things. So before I read out the other half of the quote that I want to share, I want to comment on it. So David Bentley Hart is, of course, very eloquent, very flowery with his language, and I love that. I think he's a great, great writer. But what I see behind these words is just what he's already said, just in a more flowery and attractive way. Because what he's saying is that, look, in the grand scheme of things, everything will be reconciled. Look, exactly what he said before, just in a different way. And nothing is lost, he says. The coherence of the universe is preserved by God, acting to save what he has made. Again, all of this is so theoretical. All of this is just some huge assumption on his end. And I don't like assumptions. I'm not comfortable with assumptions like that. I need good reason to believe that. And David Bentley Hart thinks, as far as he's concerned, he has good reason to believe that. But my question is, to what extent do you have evidence to believe that? Because, look, it might make sense if you're imaginative enough to make that up, but that is just a turn of cogs in your mind. There is no actual evidence. There's no biblical sort specific. And even if there was, that wouldn't even be accurate at some extent, because it's divinely inspired. It's not actually necessarily written from God directly. I mean, I'm not really a big fan of the whole written texts as evidence for God's existence anyway. I think it's kind of lazy of a God. Why doesn't he just inscribe it into our brain instead of just make it a book that we have to read? Like, it's such a mammalian concept to me. And it's just, this is my problem with the Quran. Because the Quran actually claims to be God's exact words, right? Even though Muhammad translated it and inscribed it and so on, at least the Quran has the boldness to say that it was actually written by God. And I must admit, however, that the biggest problem with the Quran for me when I read it was actually written by God, because the actual contents themselves, the contents were just so mammalian, so disappointing for a God. I mean, I just, and it's the same kind of thing here. It's just such a leap of faith. It's such a surrender of reason, I find. This bad excuse to justify children getting cancer and tsunamis happening. I mean, it's just, again, I get the philosophical concept, but I don't think it's executed reasonably. To continue the short rest of the quote, but one should consider the price at which that comfort is purchased. It requires us to believe in and love a God whose good ends will be realised not only in spite of, but entirely by way of every cruelty, every fortuitous misery, every catastrophe, every betrayal, every sin the world has ever known. It requires us to believe in the eternal spiritual necessity of a child dying an agonising death from diphtheria, of a young mother ravaged by cancer, of tens of thousands of Asians swallowed in an instant by the sea, of millions murdered in death camps and gulags and forced families, and so on. It is a strange thing indeed to seek peace in a universe rendered morally intelligible at the cost of a God rendered morally loathsome. And this is his distinction. To criticize God for his moral inconsistencies, again, is a moral pathos instead of a rational pathos. And I disagree with that. I mean, I see where he's coming from, but I don't think it's that easy to separate, because I believe I'm using my rationality to refute this kind of supposition that David Bentley Hart is making about accepting the suffering of the world. He's being very optimistic, which I must admit is a trait of the religious, obviously, because there is light at the end of the tunnel. So why wouldn't they be, I suppose? But yeah, he's trying to be ingenuous, but at the same time coming across as disingenuous. But I don't think on purpose, obviously. I respect David Bentley Hart as a thinker. I think that he's one of the best, most interesting religious thinkers of our modern time, but I'm not convinced, David Bentley Hart. I don't think that this book is very convincing, to be honest. To conclude my thoughts on the book, well, I enjoyed reading it. It is, as I said at the beginning, very, very short, relatively concise, although he does talk about things that aren't strictly necessary. I was expecting it to be more philosophical, to be more rigorous. Instead, it kind of feels like a book to console people, Christians, who are listening to this event on the news and being like, maybe they are right. It kind of feels like it's more written for a Christian than an atheist, which is really disappointing, because books don't have to be written for an atheist who analyse, review, to be convinced by even. I am maybe slightly disappointed with this one. I enjoyed his atheist delusions, although in my review of that, I even said myself that the title of the book is very misleading. It isn't remotely talking about atheist delusions. It's instead talking about paganism and the history of belief versus disbelief. It doesn't remotely even talk about like atheists having delusions of any sort. I feel like David Bentley Hart's books at this point are very misleading in the sense that this is apparently asking where was God during the tsunami. He was talking about theodicy. Yeah, he was mentioning the event, but I don't know, it doesn't feel as comprehensive as I was hoping it to be, especially from David Bentley Hart. I feel like he took a lot of intellectual liberties as well. And look, this was written in 2005, so maybe he has some updated thoughts, but for what it is, a bit disappointing. I have highlighted some interesting points as I shared some of them with you in this video, but I was expecting more from him. I must admit, I was expecting more from him. I will check out his other books because I still, as I said, I still do respect him. I accept it because it's so short, and for that reason, I'm not that disappointed. But from David Bentley Hart, yeah, I am a tiny bit. Anyway, I've been ahead of the curve. Thank you for listening to my review of The Doors of the Sea by David Bentley Hart. Thank you for watching, guys, and leave your comments, thoughts below if you think that I've been misled in some sense intellectually, or if I've misunderstood an argument. If you've read the book, then let me know. All right, over and out. I've been ahead of the curve. See ya.